Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Once again, this is Stephanie Fahuri, the Director of the Cancer Legal Resource Center, and thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Cancer in College, Your Rights in Higher Education. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. I will be recording today's webinar and sharing it on our YouTube page. We usually do post those recordings within a week or two after the webinar. So if you have friends or family or colleagues that you want to share the webinar with, you're welcome to do so at that time. I'm going to do my best to leave some time for questions at the end of the webinar. So you can always type those into the chat box or the question box. I will also try to keep an eye on the question box just in case there are any technical issues that come up, although I certainly don't anticipate that will be the case. Okay, so just a little background information about the CLRC in case any of you watching today are new to us. We are a program of the Disability Rights Legal Center. We're based in Los Angeles, California, and we run a national program, and our mission is to provide information and resources on cancer-related legal issues to patients, survivors, caregivers, healthcare professionals, employers, and anyone else that's coping with cancer. We do provide services in both English and Spanish, and we have the ability to speak to people who speak other languages through a language line. All of our services are confidential, and we do operate on an education model, which means that we don't provide direct legal representation or legal advice. I mentioned that I will be trying to leave some time for questions at the end of today's webinar. That being said, if you have questions that are very specific to your personal situation, or if you have questions that I either don't know the answer to or don't have time to answer today, there is a good way to get back in touch with us. We operate a free national telephone assistance line. We also have an online intake form where we provide individualized information on, various people's cancer-related legal questions. Again, all of our services are free, so please do feel free to reach out to us via our intake form on our website, or you can leave a message for us at our toll-free number, 866-CLRC. We obviously host webinars from time to time as you are here joining us today. Our next upcoming webinar is in October, and it's going to cover insurance and open enrollment, as well as any new developments in the insurance world, which is always interesting, and there's always new stuff to talk about every year during open enrollment. So please do, you can register for that webinar on our website. And again, we will be recording it and posting it on our YouTube page. One last thing I wanted to mention about CLRC services is that we do have a number of educational materials available on our website covering a pretty broad spectrum of legal issues. One of those resources is our Patient Legal Handbook. We are happy to send free copies to facilities, cancer organizations, other groups that might be interested in sharing copies. So the PDFs are available to download for individual use, but if you're interested in submitting a bulk order, we are sending those at no cost, and there is a order form on our website. All right. So here's an overview of what today's webinar is going to cover. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, was originally enacted by Congress in 1975 to ensure that children with disabilities have the opportunity to receive a free, appropriate public education, just like other children. However, many of the protections that are available for younger students, such as a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, and IDEA, do not apply to college-level education. It is important that students with cancer-related disabilities understand their rights and responsibilities when they're preparing for college, college-level courses, and beyond. While there are many protections that exist for students of all ages, students have more responsibilities at the college or graduate level to request and assist in identifying the accommodations that they might need. The following information can help students with disabilities prepare for and hopefully succeed in college classes and beyond. And regardless of whether, in our third section, regardless of whether you took out student loans before or after your cancer diagnosis, paying back student loans can be challenging if your income is uncertain or if you're in and out of the workforce. We will share some information in the last section of the webinar regarding student loan disability discharge and other options if you're having trouble paying back your student loans. Okay, there's a couple of laws that I'm going to be discussing today. The first is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which is a federal law that offers certain protections for people with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, also provides protection for people with disabilities in a number of different contexts. Section 504, as I mentioned, is a federal law. So anytime we're talking about a federal law, that's a law that's going to apply in every state. So it's a federal law designed to protect the rights of individuals with disabilities in programs and activities, such as educational programs, that receive federal financial assistance from the U.S. Department of Education. Recipients of this federal financial assistance include public school districts, institutions of higher education, public or private, vocational schools, and other state and local education agencies. Section 504 provides that no otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall solely by the reason of his or her disability be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And just a quick note, the photo here on this slide is a picture of the University of Utah, Salt Lake City, which is an example of a public university that receives federal funding. Going forward, I'll be referring to this law by its shorthand named Section 504. So we have another law that I wanted to discuss, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the ADA also prohibits discrimination against students with disabilities at the college level. Title II of the ADA covers state-funded schools such as universities, community college, and vocational schools. Title III of the ADA covers privately funded colleges, vocational schools, and private entities that offer certain educational exams and or courses related to occupational certification. So I mentioned that Section 504 applies to schools that receive federal financial assistance, which is the vast majority of schools. Private schools that do not receive government funds are only covered by Title III of the ADA. As a result, these institutions may be more limited in the types of accommodations they may be able to provide, depending on their available resources. Regardless of these limitations, however, they are still required to accommodate students with disabilities. So the photo on this slide is of Harvard Law School, which is private. However, even most private schools these days do accept some forms of federal funding. So the fact that a school is private does not necessarily mean that Section 504 won't apply. Certain religious colleges, for example, Hillsdale College in Michigan, have decided to forego all federal funding, which includes not accepting federal student loans. For those colleges, Section 504 might not apply. The ADA and Section 504 define disability the same way. Because these laws have a lot of complicated language, I first want to make sure we're all on the same page as to the specific definitions and how they actually define disability. A lot of folks with cancer don't necessarily always realize that their previous or current condition could, potentially qualify them for protections under some of these disability rules. So it's important to understand the law's definitions in order to know whether or not you're actually protected as a student. So to be protected as a person with a disability under the ADA or Section 504, there are three main parts to the definition. So first, you have to have an impairment. That impairment has to limit a major life activity, and the limitation has to be substantial. So physical or mental impairment is pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to go into detail about that. Just, a little more background is, we talk so much about cancer's physical impairments and the way that it can, potentially physically really cause a lot of issues throughout the body. But as we know, there are a number of mental impairments that can also impact a person with cancer's ability to perform major life activities as well. So there are some examples of what actually is a major life activity. If you have an impairment that substantially limits one of these, you might be qualified as a person with a disability under the ADA or 504. So a couple of examples, breathing, talking, walking, taking care of yourself, maybe working. It's pretty broad what could potentially constitute a major life activity. It's something that, most humans are doing on a day-to-day basis, can be something that impacts major bodily functions, and some examples of mental impairments that might substantially limit a major life activity could be chemo brain, depression, or anxiety. A substantial limitation is an inability to perform a major life activity in the way that an average person in society would be able to perform it. The determination of whether a student has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity is something that's made on the basis of an individual inquiry. So what's a substantial limitation for one person might not be a substantial limitation for somebody else. So basically the determination of whether or not someone's condition qualifies them as a person with a disability under these laws is really looked at on a case-by-case basis. Some of the factors that are looked at to determine whether something is a substantial limitation could be the nature and severity of, the limitation, the expected or actual duration of the impairment, the impact of the disability on your life. So, as I said, it's really looked at on a case-by-case basis. The ADA and 504 do not only apply to people who currently have disabilities. So even if you've had a disability in the past, so for example, childhood cancer survivors or cancer that is now in remission, you may still be protected by these laws. A student may be protected from disability discrimination in higher education if he currently has an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, has a history of an impairment, is regarded as having a disability. So that's where, for example, if someone was diagnosed with cancer, has completed treatment, and is enrolling in a new school or class, that person might be capable of completing the coursework, but if the school or the professor treats someone differently because of their history, or if they're treating you differently because they know or because they think that you are potentially disabled even if you aren't, that's potentially not okay. There's also potentially the option for protection as a caregiver or as someone who has a relationship with or is associated with someone as a disability. So there are a number of different ways that students can be protected. It's not just, do you currently have cancer or not? Okay, so moving on here, now that we're all on the same page about how the relevant laws define the term disability and who's protected by these laws, the next question is, okay, so what? So what do colleges, vocational schools, universities, and other higher ed institutions, what are they required to do for students who have disabilities? These schools may be required to provide accommodations, also known as academic adjustments or auxiliary aids to students with disabilities. So the next section is going to cover accommodations and where, when, and how to request them. So the first question, how am I protected during the admissions process? Both the ADA and 504 ensure that students with disabilities may not be denied admission to any school on the basis of their disability. A college or university may not use discriminatory methods to screen out or limit the number of students with disabilities that can apply or be admitted. Furthermore, the actual application cannot ask applicants if they have a disability. And once a student has been admitted, a school can ask whether a student has a disability on a confidential basis to determine whether accommodations might be needed. Students are not required to disclose their disabilities if they don't actually need accommodations. However, they must self-disclose in order to receive accommodations. Students may choose to discuss their needs privately with the Disability Services Coordinator or whoever else sort of takes on that role at whichever school, rather than disclose their disability on a form that they receive from the school. So, it's certainly your prerogative to talk to someone in person rather than, just writing about your disability on a piece of paper. Okay. Sometimes a student's disability may affect his or her transcripts or qualifications when applying to college, grad school, or any other post-secondary school. If this situation applies to you, there may be a few options available. First, some schools allow for extra documents to be submitted with your application. These documents are sometimes referred to as addenda. An addendum gives you the opportunity to explain why a particular transcript or entrance exam may not be entirely reflective of you as a student or your academic capability. Some examples of when an addendum might be appropriate could be if you have a bad entrance exam score, a really bad grade in one particular course, if it took you extra time to complete a particular grade in high school, or you have a long gap in your previous school attendance. Another option aside from an addendum is you might consider talking about your disability and how it affected your academic performance. Some people like to write their personal statement or essays that are attached to their applications about their life-changing experience of having cancer and how that's affected their career goals. Again, some students may not feel comfortable discussing their personal experiences, especially if they don't want to tell their school that they have a disability. So this is going to be something that's, going to be pretty personal. And if you're not interested in making that disclosure and you don't need accommodations, then by all means, you are absolutely able to keep that stuff confidential. If you currently have a disability and need some sort of accommodation in order to take an entrance exam or some other similar exam, it's important to request accommodations as early as possible. So the ADA actually covers all sorts of entrance exams and other sorts of standardized testing. Essentially, exams administered by any private, state, or local government entity related to applications, licensing, certification, credentialing for secondary or post-secondary education, professional, or trade purposes are all covered by the ADA, and testing accommodations do have to be provided. So students with documented disabilities can apply for accommodations when they take college board exams. So all of these different types of exams, right? The GED, SAT, ACT to get into college, the LSAT or MCAT for law school or med school, the GRE for certain grad school classes. You can potentially request accommodations for all of those tests. The requests are made to whoever administers those tests. So for the SAT or AP exams, it's through the College Board. For the GRE, it's through ETS, Educational Testing Services. So depending on what exam you're looking to take, you might need to do a little bit more poking around on the website to figure out what the process is to request accommodations. For the College Board, for SAT or AP exams, They really encourage students to work with their schools to request accommodations and testing. You can submit forms on your own, but they really strongly encourage that you just work with the school because the school potentially already has experience requesting accommodations for other students as well. One important thing to keep in mind is that it can take a long time to actually ensure that these accommodations are going to be provided. So if it could take 7 weeks or longer, it's best to request early. For some of these tests, you have to request the accommodation before you can even schedule your exam. That's the case for the GRE. But for some of the other exams that are given on a regular basis, you might be able to request those accommodations on a slightly different time frame. So testing accommodations are changes to the regular testing environment and auxiliary aids and services that allow individuals with disabilities to demonstrate their true aptitude or achievement level on standardized exams or other high-stakes tests. Testing entities must ensure that the test scores of individuals with disabilities accurately reflect how the person, what their aptitude is or their achievement level. So they have to make sure that they're administering their exam so that it's fair to people with disabilities as well as to those who don't have disabilities. Examples of testing accommodations could include extra time, quiet space for an exam, the ability to bring in food or drinks or medication potentially. Sometimes people need additional break periods to use the restroom or for any other reason. If you use a wheelchair and the testing location that is not, if it's not planned to be wheelchair accessible, they might locate an alternative location for you to take the exam. So really what type of accommodation you might need in testing is going to depend on what your limitations are. So once you start school, students with disabilities who need accommodations to make it possible for them to successfully take entrance exams might also need some support once they're accepted into school and enroll in classes. So how do the ADA and Section 504 protect higher education students once they're enrolled? Well, just like companies that are required to provide testing accommodations, colleges and universities are required to make reasonable accommodations for students with disabilities. These types of accommodations can also be called academic adjustments. The accommodations may include modification to the school's practices, policies, and procedures. And it could also include the provision of auxiliary aids and other services. An appropriate accommodation is determined through an interactive process, so it's sort of a negotiation. And that's based on the student's disability and their individual needs. A school is not required to make any adjustments that would fundamentally alter the nature of a service, program, or activity. And they're not required to provide accommodations to students who don't disclose that they have a disability. So that's why disclosure can be really important. If you don't need accommodations, you can keep it to yourself. If you really do need some sort of adjustment or auxiliary aid, you will have to disclose to the school that you need that. Okay. So once it's been determined that you are a qualified individual with a disability under the ADA or under 504, you're entitled to request reasonable accommodation from your school. Keep in mind that these requests do have to be reasonable. You can't ask for an accommodation that would completely change the nature of the class or what you would be learning or evaluated on. For example, we spoke with a caller once who was struggling to make it to her college chemistry class due to her ongoing medical condition and last-minute doctor appointments. Unfortunately, the class had a significant lab component and attendance at the lab sessions were mandatory. Although she attended all but one of the lab sessions, her professor failed her and refused to let her make up the one lab session she missed, and instead insisted that she repeat the entire class, which costs money, by the way. That is an expense for the student. In this case, it might not have been reasonable to ask the professor to waive the lab component altogether, especially if it was integral to the class. But perhaps the professor could have done something else to accommodate her needs instead of simply demanding that the entire class be repeated. Making up the lab session, attending the session during a different semester to make it up, and maybe, clearing out an incomplete as opposed to a failure might have been alternative options, or potentially assigning other alternative work that could have been done from home. We've also spoken to students with other attendance issues where the professors were able to accommodate with some of the above options or some of the options I just talked about, or by simply adjusting the attendance policy for that specific student. Some of the types of reasonable accommodations that a person with cancer might need could be extra time on exams, potentially note taker services, access to adaptive technology, maybe like a screen reader, or additional excused absences. This is not a complete list, just some examples. So all school programs, including extracurricular activities, must be accessible to students with disabilities. If a college offers housing, it must provide convenient and accessible housing to students with disabilities who need it, and it cannot cost more money for a person with a disability to use the accessible housing. A school may not charge a student for an accommodation that he or she needs. A school may also not charge its students with disabilities more tuition or program costs than it does for other students. So if you've been accepted into a college or graduate program and you have a disability that needs an accommodation, you might be wondering, how do I go about actually doing that? Most post-secondary educational institutions have an office or a designated individual, such as a disability services coordinator or an access coordinator, who's responsible for coordinating accommodations for students with disabilities. Students can get information about the school's procedures for requesting accommodations through this office or this individual. If you're not sure who that person is or how to get to them, you can often look on the school's website. It might be listed under health services, learning accommodations, student resources, and if it's still really not clear, you could try contacting the Dean of Academic Services, the Dean of Student Services, or even potentially the admissions office to find out who's responsible for ADA accommodations. While you'll need to disclose your disability after you're admitted if you need accommodations, you can exercise control over when and to whom you disclose this information. The school does have to keep the request confidential, but the school can request medical documentation to show that you actually do need the accommodation that you've asked for. It's really important to request an accommodation as soon as you know you might need one. This will enable you and the school to plan accordingly. Some accommodations may require some time to arrange, and it's generally more costly and more difficult for a school to secure accommodations on short notice. Waiting too long to ask for an accommodation might also mean that your disability affects your performance on a test or project, and poor performance could ultimately result in you receiving a poor grade, or in the example that I mentioned a couple slides ago, you might have to repeat a class. If the need for an accommodation arises unexpectedly once you've started a program, or if your need for accommodations changes, contact your school's disability services office coordinator as soon as possible, or whoever it is that you have figured out is the person to talk to at your school. They might have different titles at different schools. So, going back to the example I gave a couple slides ago, we have spoken with other students over the years who were hesitant to talk to professors or teaching assistants about their potential need for extra time or additional excused absences. Unfortunately, that did lead to several of them failing classes, needing to repeat classes, or getting incompletes. It's been our experience that some professors are much less willing to make accommodations for students after their performance in a class has suffered. Whether or not that's fair is a different question, but it does sometimes look a little bit fishy, I guess, if someone's performance has really suffered and then they later come with the excuse that there was some other accommodation that they needed. It doesn't look particularly professional to not have requested an accommodation in a timely manner if you knew that you had the need for an accommodation. And the same is true in the workplace. So, a lot of these tips and a lot of the information that applies here within higher education and other colleges and schools does, sometimes bleed over to the working world as well, and the way that the ADA applies at work. So I mentioned that a school can potentially request medical documentation to show that you actually have a need for an accommodation. Accommodations are determined through an interactive process, which I mentioned is sort of like a negotiation. So it's helpful to think about what types of accommodations might suit you best and put your request in writing. Try to be as specific as possible so that all of your concerns can be addressed properly with an accommodation or modification. In addition, the request should describe how your disability affects your participation in school. That's known as the functional limitation, and how your recommended accommodations can help you. Schools may also differ in the documentation they require you to show, so you might want to check and see what types of documentation your specific school requires and have it ready to submit with your accommodation request. So they might need to know about the nature, severity, and duration of your impairment, how your daily activities are limited, how substantial that limitation is, how your disability affects your participation in school. So one example could be just a signed letter from your treating physician that verifies your disability and functional limitations, and maybe make some suggestions about ways that you could be accommodated. So what if your accommodation request is denied? Try contacting the Dean of Academic Services, Dean of Student Services, or Admissions Office, or whoever is in charge of the ADA accommodations at your school. If your school denies your request, or if you're dissatisfied with the accommodation you receive, you may have access to an appeals process or some sort of reconsideration. If you've tried to speak to a professor directly about an accommodation and he or she has denied it, make sure you also talk to whoever is in charge of ADA accommodations at your school. Along the same lines, if you've only spoken to the ADA coordinator and not to your professors, try speaking with your professors directly. Some may be more accommodating than you anticipate. So it really is going to vary from professor to professor or school to school, who the better option is to talk to. It's best to potentially talk to the disability services coordinator so that you can ensure that you get accommodations in all of your classes. But if there's only one class in particular that's causing potential issues, and you know that the professor, is friendly or, sensitive to, your potential issues, you could always try talking to the professor directly and just getting accommodations for that specific class. So what if you think your school is discriminating against you based on your disability status? Well, all government-funded schools must have a grievance procedure for addressing discrimination complaints. If your situation cannot be resolved informally or by discussing the matter with the disability services coordinator or point person responsible for ensuring 504 and ADA compliance, you can follow your school's grievance procedures. One example of a school resource that would explain this information would be your school's student handbook. You might find this information on your school's website as well. If you're unhappy with the results of your school's grievance procedures or want to pursue an alternative to those procedures, you can file a complaint against your school with the Department of Education by contacting the Office for Civil Rights. Note, you do only have 180 days following the date of a discriminatory action to file your complaint, so that's just something to keep in mind. So here's a couple of resources to get more information about civil rights of students with disabilities. You can always check out the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights or the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, which gives more information about the ADA. Okay, so moving along here, student loans account for over $1 trillion in debt in America. While some students need to take out loans in order to afford college, education-related debt can often take a long time to pay off and requires careful planning. It's often difficult to pay back student loans. Trust me, it is very difficult to pay back student loans for many of us, and an unexpected cancer diagnosis could make it even more difficult to repay some of these loans. But there is a program that might be able to help. If you're facing a situation where you think you might not be able to pay your loans, or if you're already falling behind on your payments, there are a few different options you can look into. While I won't be discussing all of the different types of loan repayment plans, because those do seem to change from year to year, and I'm not a loan servicer, and nor do I work for the Department of Education. It's important to talk to your loan servicer if you're struggling to make payments. It's possible that you might qualify for an alternative repayment plan or schedule, and there are repayment plans based around your income. So there are some income-driven repayment plans. Usually there's a 10-year standard repayment plan, and then there are a number of other options. Keep in mind that you might be able to get one of these options, a deferment or a forbearance, regardless of what types of loans you have, whether they're private or federal loans. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on each of these on the next few slides. If you're facing a temporary loss of wages or funds, you might want to consider requesting a deferment of your student loans. A deferment is a period during which repayment of the principal balance of your loan is temporarily delayed. During a deferment, you do not need to make payments. Additionally, depending on the type of loan you have, the federal government may pay the interest on your loans during that deferment. So that might apply to a federal Perkins loan, direct subsidized loan, or subsidized federal Stafford loans. The government does not pay the interest on your unsubsidized loans or on any plus loans that you might have. You are responsible for paying the interest that accrues during the deferment period, but your payment is not due during the deferment period. If you don't pay the interest on your loan during deferment, it may be capitalized, which means it's added to your principal balance, and the amount you pay in the future will be higher. Some accepted reasons for deferment of repayment, so it's really just pushing off when the due date is for your loans. So some accepted reasons include the inability to find work, a period of economic hardship, or a period of active military duty. To request a deferment, you can contact your loan servicer. You can literally just call whatever number is on your student loan bills, or there might be a chat function depending on who your loan servicer is on their website. One thing to keep in mind is that there might be limits on how many deferments you can actually request. You can't just defer forever, sadly. For example, students are often granted deferments while they're still in school. That makes sense. You don't have to start paying your student loans while you're still in school. And then there's often a 6-month grace period after graduation before loans go into repayment. If you can't make your scheduled loan payments and you don't qualify for a deferment for any reason, your loan servicer may be able to grant you a forbearance. With forbearance, you may be able to stop making payments or reduce your monthly payment for up to 12 months. Interest will continue to accrue on your subsidized and unsubsidized loans, including all plus loans. To request a forbearance, again, you would contact your loan servicer. So there are two different types of forbearances. First, there's a mandatory forbearance. So if you meet very specific criteria, your loan servicer might be required to give you a forbearance. So the mandatory forbearance is required when you're serving a medical or dental internship or residency program and you meet specific requirements. If the amount you owe each month for all student loans you received is 20% or more of your total monthly gross income. If you're serving in a national service position for which you received a National Service Award, performing a teaching service that would qualify for teacher loan forgiveness. And then there's a couple of other, if you're a member of the National Guard and have been activated, but you're not eligible for a military deferment. So really specific criteria in order to be eligible for a mandatory forbearance. As the name of the other type of forbearance implies, a discretionary forbearance is one that's really just up to the loan servicer and whether or not they decide. You can request a discretionary forbearance for financial hardship, for illness, but then it is up to them as to whether or not they actually want to grant it. So what if you're unable to pay back your student loans and it looks like you're probably never going to be able to? So this isn't something where it's a temporary financial hardship or you just lost your job, but you're planning to go back into the workforce. If it looks like, you're on disability benefits or you're receiving veteran disability benefits and it's unlikely that you're going to be able to go back to work maybe ever, and you're struggling to pay your student loans, there is a program that might potentially provide some assistance. So if you borrowed certain types of federal loans to attend college or graduate school and have a total and permanent disability, you may qualify to have your student loans forgiven or discharged, so you don't have to pay them back. The federal government has a program called Total and Permanent Disability Discharge, also known as TPD, and it applies only to very specific types of loans. William D. Ford federal direct loans, federal family education loans, and or federal Perkins loans. So direct loans, FFEL, or Perkins loans. The program also applies to individuals who have to complete a teach grant service obligation. So the TPD discharge only applies to federal loans that you borrowed for college. It only applies to those specific loans that I just mentioned. A TPD discharge relieves you from having to pay those specific loans on the basis of your total and permanent disability. Private student loans, on the other hand, borrowed from a bank or other financial institution, so these would be loans that you got not through submitting a FAFSA or going through the Department of Education's website. These would be loans borrowed directly from a bank or other financial institution. They're not eligible for the TPD discharge program. Private loans are not subsidized or regulated by the federal government and do not have the same types of discharge, deferment, or forbearance options that are available for federal loans. If you're unable to pay a private loan, it's best to contact the private lender and find out if you can negotiate some of the debt or come up with an alternative repayment plan. They might grant you a deferment or forbearance, but the rules are just a little bit different because the federal government is not involved here. If you're watching this webinar in anticipation of going to college or graduate school and you're trying to learn more about student loans, please keep this in mind. Private loans often have high interest rates, and because they're not regulated the same way as federal loans, we hear from more people dealing with private loans that they have more issues with paying back those private loans than maybe some of the other federal loans that are available. So in terms of the TPD program, before the loans can be discharged, so it's not just a matter of, am I receiving SSDI or veteran benefits, or has my doctor said that I'm permanently disabled? You do actually have to go through and submit another application to provide information to the Department of Education showing that you're totally and permanently disabled. There's different ways that you can do that. So it depends on whether you're a veteran, are receiving SSDI or SSI benefits through the Social Security Administration, or if you have a long-term disability that prevents you from working. So the TPD Discharge website is disabilitydischarge.com, which I believe I have on a later slide. And their application process section of their website is very clear and detailed, and it goes through in a lot of detail what's required. You can also contact them by phone, but depending on your situation, you'll have to provide evidence about your Veterans Affairs disability, evidence about your SSI or SSDI determination, or you'll have to have a physician certification that shows that you have a disability that has lasted at least 5 years continuously and is expected to last for at least another 5 years or end in death. So NELNET is the name of the agency that administers this TPD discharge program. And they actually do receive information directly from the VA and from the Social Security Administration about total and permanent disabilities. So it's possible that if you are receiving some of either of those benefits, you might actually get information directly from NELNET. They might contact you about potentially submitting a TPD discharge application. So if you haven't been contacted by NELNET, you can submit an application with supporting documentation. Once you contact NELNET about your potential loan discharge, your student loan payments could be suspended for up to 120 days. If they do not receive your application within the 120-day period, you might have to start paying your loans back again. So if your TPD discharge request is approved, you will be notified by NELNET. Any loan payments you've made on or after you became totally and permanently disabled will be returned to you, and your loans will then be discharged. Depending on how you showed your disability, you may be subject to a 3-year monitoring period that begins from your TPD discharge date. If this applies to you, you will have to meet certain requirements to keep your loans discharged. If the 3-year monitoring period applies to you, your loans will be discharged for the first 3 years after your TPD discharge. You do not have to make payments towards your loans for these 3 years. However, you may have to begin repaying your loans again or fulfill your teach grant service obligation if during the monitoring period your employment income exceeds a certain level, if you receive a new direct loan, Perkins loan, or teach grant, if your disability status changes for purposes of SSDI or SSI benefits you might be receiving. So it's important to keep in mind that just having your application approved doesn't necessarily mean that you are 100% in the clear at that point. If your loans are approved, or if your application is approved, you might go through this 3-year monitoring period where they're basically checking to see, okay, is this person actually totally and permanently disabled? After the 3-year monitoring period is over, if you have continued to meet all of their eligibility criteria, at that point your loans will officially be discharged, and you won't have to worry about paying them back. So one really troubling aspect of the TPD discharge program is that, at least in the past, if you got your student loans discharged through the TPD program, that was a huge win. You didn't have to pay those back on a monthly basis. Unfortunately, the total amount that was discharged was potentially considered income for income tax purposes. So depending on when you get your TPD discharge, it's possible that it could have been counted as income and you may have had to have paid taxes on that. However, because of a change in federal law related to the taxability of loan amounts discharged due to TPD, the answer of whether or not it's taxable as income will depend on when you received the discharge. If you received a TPD discharge of a loan before January 1st, 2018, the loan amount discharged may be considered income for federal tax purposes under the IRS rules. If you received a TPD discharge of a loan after January 1st, 2018, the discharge loan won't be considered income for federal tax purposes. For purposes of determining whether a loan amount was discharged due to TPD, it may be treated as taxable income for federal tax purposes. The date you're considered to have received the discharge is different depending on how you qualified. So it is a little bit complicated here. If you're a veteran who showed that you're permanently disabled based on a VA disability determination, you're considered to have received the discharge the date that they approved it. So there's no, they don't take into account any sort of monitoring period. On the other hand, if you show that you're permanently disabled based on documentation from the Social Security Administration or from a physician's note and had the 3-year monitoring period, you're considered to have received the discharge for federal tax purposes at the end of the monitoring period. So if you had, from my understanding of how this would work then, is that if you had received an approval of your application, let's say in 2017, but were subject to a 3-year monitoring period, your date of discharge wouldn't, for tax purposes, wouldn't be until 2020, which is after the 3-year monitoring period. In that case, because that would be after January 1st, 2018, if you had your student loans discharged at that time, you wouldn't have to worry about paying federal income tax on that amount. Unfortunately, states might count this as taxable income, and so that's probably going to vary from state to state. If you received a TPD discharge of a federal student loan, you might want to consult with your state tax office or a tax professional before you file your state tax return. And honestly, it's probably an even better idea to talk to a tax professional or your state tax office before you even submit the application, just so you know what you're getting yourself into. Sometimes we get questions that I'll just, highlight here really quickly about whether loan discharge might affect Medicaid or Medicare eligibility. And so I just wanted to flag that, generally loan discharge will not affect Medicaid coverage. For Medicaid beneficiaries whose eligibility is based just on their income, the discharge will not affect coverage during that 3-year monitoring period. And in terms of Medicare, the loan discharge will not affect a borrower's eligibility for Medicare and generally will not affect any subsidies a borrower might receive that help him or her pay for their Medicare premiums and cost-sharing obligations. So here are a couple of resources related to student loans. I mentioned the U.S. Department of Education. If you have questions about the TPD Discharge program, please do visit disabilitydischarge.com. I think their website is excellent, and they have a lot of really clear explanations and descriptions of what you might need to provide if you're interested in applying. The Student Loan Borrower Assistance Program, or it's a project of the National Consumer Law Center, has some really helpful information. And then the Federal Student Aid website also is pretty helpful. So that is all I was planning to cover today. I'm going to stop the recording now. I'm happy to try to answer 1 or 2 questions with the 5 minutes I have left, if there are any.